So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you all Bill Sisson, who is the Executive Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development North America. So WBCSD is a global company that is a collection of large corporations that are intent on solving big sustainability problems. And Bill has been involved with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for, I'd say at least 15 years, I think. It started as an organization started by the former CEO of United Technologies, and Bill was UTC's interface to the organization for many years. And then prior to that, he was director of research programs at United Technologies for Carrier Corporation, where he happened to be my boss. So it is my pleasure to introduce you. And Bill, I think, we usually go for about 45 minutes, and then there will be questions. And as they arise, I think either Arvind or I will interrupt. And then following this, we'll have half an hour of discussion for anybody that wants to stick around. So, Bill.
Thanks so much, Scott, for the opportunity to present to what I consider to be a fairly prestigious team of researchers, innovators, and important players in the space of Mitsubishi Electric. So really a pleasure to have the opportunity. And let me just run right away with it here. So let me first get my presentation started. So just bear with me for 1 second, and just somebody give me a thumbs up that there's this image on your screen that looks like a presentation.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, awesome. And it is in presenter mode. You're not seeing presenter view, so it's full up. Yeah, WBCSD, it's an organization, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's been around for 27 years. It was formed as the basis of bringing the voice of business into critical conversations that are impacting the globe. At the time, obviously, climate change was on the horizon, but it's become so much more where business is involved in various topics, and we'll get into that. We have a really important vision, though, which is to create a world in which 9 billion people are living well within the boundaries of our planet by mid-century. And that's not a small undertaking by any means. So today I thought I'd give you a bit of background on WBCSD, who we are as an organization. I know this group is fairly technical. So in the context of some of how you all might think about corporate sustainability and where it's been and where it's headed might be of interest to you. I'm sure many of you have heard this term of late, ESG, environmental, social, and the governance structures that go along with that has become kind of the mainstream of how business thinks about this topic these days. So we'll touch a little bit on that. And then I thought, I think this is where the real perhaps interest of you as an organization, where is innovation going in the context of sustainability, and what are maybe some things that you might want to start thinking about relative to the work that is associated with built environment? So let me move right ahead. Who we are as an organization: we are a CEO-led community of now about 220 of the world's leading sustainable businesses. We are a collective organization of those we consider to be the best performers in sustainable development when it comes to the corporate sector. We're global in context, so you'll see our footprint has no one dominant geography. We are a business-only platform, so we think about business, we think about the impact on business, we think about how the businesses of today and in the future will need to think about these problems. We are a structured council, so we do have the leadership of many of our member companies, CEOs, involved in helping us to shape and drive the agenda forward. And of course, we want to be market-driven. We're not philanthropic. We're not thinking about saving the world as a context. We're thinking about how business needs to thrive and survive in a world that's transitioning to being more sustainable. So we want to create this formation, this framework for businesses where we can accelerate the transition to a sustainable world by making more sustainable businesses more successful. And so that sort of forms the basis of our existence. I love to show this chart just to say that you can look at this collective group of members in any which way you want. You can find your peers. You can find that there's a cross-sector representation. You can find that there's a cross-geographical representation. Today, the organization is about 40% European and about 30% North America and Asia. So we are growing in kind of global framing of ourselves as members. And you'll probably recognize a few interesting members of ours that might relate to who you are as an organization. We talk about 3 global challenges at WBCSD. We all are aware of the emergency we have on climate. It is imperative that businesses understand the implications of the climate emergency on how they think about their business. We're also nature in crisis. Scott was asking me just a few minutes before we got started whether we had any involvement in the recent Conference of Parties in Montreal looking at nature and biodiversity. And the answer is yes, we are actively involved in those conversations because nature is increasingly important. It's not interdependent. It's not its own issue. It is cross-linked with the other issues. And of course, mounting inequality. You can't go anywhere around the world these days without seeing the pressure on societies and whether or not there's fair and equitable treatment amongst how we think about these problems is certainly part of becoming more and more a part of the business agenda. So at WBCSD, we are seeing ourselves as the organization that drives the how-to for systems transformation. We need companies to take ownership of becoming net zero, driving and striving towards being nature positive, and dealing with these equitable challenges that they as businesses face in society. But we're also the collective of that cross-sector representation where value chains are formed in the basis of understanding those interactions between supply chain, suppliers, where you sit in the value chain and your downstream customers is certainly an important factor that we need to all be thinking about. And lastly, and this comes to fruition in how we structure ourselves, if you're not paying attention to some of these issues regarding capital market engagement, they've become very important in the last 5 years. Certainly the financial markets are building out mechanisms where these are metrics that are being used to evaluate and assess the well-being of companies in terms of their investability, in terms of their loanability, and increasingly the reference to how sustainability has become a proxy for performance of different companies. So we're an organization working on those fundamental issues together with our business. You may be familiar with other organizations out there like the World Economic Forum or the World Resources Institute. We like to believe we're kind of straddling between those two organizations to help drive the agenda with our members going forward. In terms of our structure, we talk about the 3 imperatives that all companies must be dealing with. We talked about these earlier. Climate action, nature action, and equity action are built into our portfolio of effort. We also look at how to take these imperatives across different, call them verticals or sectors. We're very active in food and agriculture, in products and materials where circularity finds its home, in transport and mobility, in built environment, which I know is a core area of interest for you all. And of course, the energy and energy systems transformation are increasingly important. Our redefining value work is where we find that important part of how companies think about information and disclosure and transparency with the capital markets, which is a changing landscape than you might have been familiar in maybe 10 years ago. We also have enablers. Maybe this is important for some of you to consider in the structure of what we offer. We do have a robust education platform, which helps companies to inform and raise knowledge awareness amongst their, they're very important people in this space within the companies. We also look to help our members with how they disclose, how they address some of the key objectives that we have as an organization, and engaging in the policy and advocacy work, like at the COP or at the UN General Assembly or other places where there's a gathering of both decision makers and business leaders around some of these issues. Perhaps last but not least, just thinking about the structure of the how-to agenda. We want to work to establish the right guidelines, the right frameworks, the right protocols. We were very active in the earliest of our days on the formation of the greenhouse gas protocol, which a lot of companies use today. We developed that together with WRI. We're also all about developing tools and technologies and frameworks to help companies practice sustainability. We want to shape policy developments through advocacy and building proper coalitions and industry partnerships to help us do that. We know we as an organization, like our members, can't do a lot of this on our own. We have to build structures that make and enable decision-making to take place. And then last but not least, we are a resource for our members in terms of the types of knowledge we create, but also the cross-development, the cross-sharing of best practice and knowledge and expertise that together with our members certainly helps us drive the agenda forward. So that's a bit of a WBCSD primer in terms of who we are, what we do, how we get work done, and the types of things we produce along the way. I thought I'd now shift a bit into, where is sustainability in the corporate agenda today? How has it changed in, say, the last 15 to 20 years? And where do we see sort of the real work driving forward? So I like to use this chart to basically say, historically, companies used to think of corporate sustainability as a place where they could talk about all the good things that they did. It was virtually an unchecked sort of way of communicating how companies were practicing sustainability, the types of things they were doing. There was corporate philanthropy involved, and certainly this framing of CSR, corporate social responsibility, was at the basis of existence 20 years ago. Sustainability today is gone what we call mainstream. Companies are increasingly being challenged by various stakeholders in the mix of consideration for how they're impacting how companies think about this topic today. So it's back to some of the things I mentioned earlier. The capital markets are certainly applying pressure on companies to think differently about their performance and execution in this space. The materiality of how companies think about these problems and how they impact their business and add risk to their business are certainly very front and center. And ESG has become way more integrated across the organization in terms of how companies think about this going forward. And a different way of thinking about that is presented here, where I like to say, sustainability in companies has moved from somewhat being an informal representation of the company's position on some of these issues to a much more formal, much more informed, much more standards, in fact, driven understanding of ESG in the company's performance. So that means it's shifted from what you might have thought of as a single person or maybe a small team in a company dealing with corporate sustainability, maybe a core CSO function, to one that's become much more integrated across functions. We know I have member companies that basically have a core responsibility of sustainability now built into all of the practices, all of the operations of the company, whether it's procurement, whether it's technology and innovation and engineering, whether it's HR and hiring resources, whether it's operations. It's all now become way more integrated in terms of how companies are practicing these problems, practicing the solutions on these problems. I'd also like to point out that there are these frames of reference in how we think about reporting. You may be familiar with these terminology in the greenhouse gas protocol called scope 1 and 2. Well, scope 1 and 2 are those emissions which I as a company can control. They're in my operations. They're in my decision-making about how I run my factories. They're in my decision-making about the choices I make in terms of transportation of resources. However, Scope 3 are those emissions that are beyond the borders of the company. They're my supply chain in many cases. They are the decisions I make and how I supply goods into my company. And they're also in your consumers, in your consumption chain. They're how your customers are using your products and solutions going forward. Scope 3 has become probably one of the biggest agenda items in the last 5 years relative to how companies are thinking about those challenges. They can't control those emissions directly, but they can certainly control those emissions by how they take decisions on the suppliers they use or on how they inform consumers on the use of their products. This has become a huge topic. In many cases, Scope 3 is on the order of 80 to 90% of a company's overall emissions footprint, just to put that in perspective. So the sustainability professional and the organizations that are dealing with this are dealing with these sort of 4 large clusters of transformation. You know, obviously the choices we make on energy solutions and how they impinge and impact on the climate issues are certainly front and center in the consideration of everything we do, whether it's in the procurement cycle, whether it's in the engineering cycle. The choices we make on energy systems required is certainly going to be important going forward. On the scene, materials and circularity. So today, maybe 10% of what we use is returned in some form back into the supply chain. We're 10% circular today. That's way not good enough. We're way too dependent on these linear take, use, throw away systems, and that's going to be changing in the very near future. Way more emphasis on elimination of plastics waste, for instance, is going to be front and center in the decision-making process. I mentioned nature loss and biodiversity. We just saw the general agreement reached at COP15 in Montreal of an agreement to create 30% set aside of nature preserved systems by 2030. This is a big opportunity. It's very important for us to sort of get our arms around how to get nature positive. And a lot of the choices we make need to start considering the implications on natural systems that go into our products and decision making. And last but not least, labor practice and supply chains, the S in ESG, the social factors, how we as companies think about those issues relative to the choices we make in the supply chains we use. So today's sustainability professional is much more concerned about protecting the firm's future value. It's not just about thinking about these topics as what are we doing well and what are we doing good. It's about, will my company be surviving 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now? The regulatory pressures are immense. There's increasing regulations arriving on the scene. Europe is ahead in many of these regards with the European Union imposing requirements on companies there to be much more transparent and disclose much more information on these topics. But here in the US, our Securities and Exchange Commission is expected to pass the first climate disclosure regulation in the first quarter of next year. It's gone through a very certain myriad of release and feedback mechanisms and others. We're expecting to see that now become regulatory law here in the US by the first quarter. We'll talk a little bit about valuation and investor support here in a moment, but your customers are increasingly going to be demanding solutions in this space. And I think that does bring us back a bit to the innovation agenda that we'll come to in at the last part of the presentation. So hold on to that. We talk about the nature of how companies are having to better understand the information they're putting out there with a greater degree of certainty. So there's no accusations around overstatement, no accusations around greenwashing, because financial markets are paying real attention to these issues. So suddenly, and probably in the last 5-10 years, you have seen this transition that I started with, of the formality of sustainability becoming much more much more concentrated on how companies are thinking about these things and how their information is being used to better inform decision making in not just within their own companies, but in the supply chains that they operate and in the financial markets where this information is being utilized. So let me talk a little bit about that. You may find this surprising if you're not paying attention to it, but today, just about $1 out of every $3 of assets under management globally are invested in an ESG derived fund. That means companies are being populated in investment opportunities with a parameter space around environmental social governance. It's being used to bring companies in, but it's also being used to exclude companies from being within those portfolios. That's got some people upset. I might suggest you may be seeing some of that in the media and the press, but organizations like BlackRock, Larry Fink is quite vocal about these issues and how material they are to the investment community. They're affecting how companies will perform and how they will transact over the next 10, 20 years. And this is starting to become very important in how capital markets are making these assessments. So along with that goes some interesting trends on performance. And we're seeing that companies that have historically invested more of their efforts in these ESG space, topics, and made that information available and disclosed that information visibly into the marketplace are actually performing better within the financial markets. So the other thing that's happening is we're moving from this voluntary set of mechanisms that companies have been using for the last 20 years to now becoming much more mandatory. I've mentioned already the European Union has a very aggressive set of regulatory frameworks that they are pushing ahead on as to how companies will be required to disclose on their ESG performance. And I mentioned already earlier that we've got structures now coming out of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission that are going to require U.S. traded companies to also do the same, particularly around the climate agenda. Also, on the government side of the equation, we're seeing much more aggressive actions being taken. Of course, the Biden administration and the relative importance that this topic has with the administration has certainly led to a number of not only executive orders, but this year we've seen the first ever real, sort of foundational climate law put into play with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest ever investment in climate action ever. So this is, I think this is certainly an opportunity for many companies to explore those areas that will affect them as businesses that are associated with this agenda. I think if you look at, for instance, the building sector, in particular in the IRA, and I'm no expert here, but certainly there are a number of opportunities that will affect how your customers are thinking about leveraging the resources that will be made available to them in the Inflation Reduction Act as it gets its legs and starts to get traction over the next few years. And then last but not least here, ESG, the whole topic of sustainability, ESG has really become a proxy for the performance of companies. Whether it's your top line growth and you're making investments in those areas of your business that will affect how your consumers and your business will be affected on top line, or whether it's on your bottom line. Cost reductions and efficiency improvements are clearly an outcome benefit of making investments in these places. Productivity uplift. Many employees are now being brought into the workforce with sustainability as sort of a core requirement for the companies they work for. So decision-making in terms of not only your future recruits, but even those that are in the organization today are thinking more inherently about these issues and how they affect them and their personal situations going forward. We've talked a bit about how the financial markets are involved, and certainly we don't see that trend changing at all. If anything, it will be increasing. So ESG performance companies, it very much is the state of affairs today in terms of how companies are practicing these topics. And the ones that are most serious are certainly starting to see the benefits of a lower cost of capital and increased investor confidence as a result. Not to say that they're also attracting talent, perhaps more favorably than those that aren't practicing in these areas. So that's kind of the state of affairs of sustainability. It's really seen that transition, as I sort of simply defined, from that informal place where you had a corner office probably thinking about how they were going to report these things in their annual sustainability report, to a much more material world where capital markets are increasingly expecting information to flow from companies to help them inform how they take decisions in terms of investability, in terms of loanability, and in terms of their confidence in you as companies to invest in. So let me shift now into the final sort of leg of this sprint on innovation. And still relatively high level, we'll talk a little bit about how these sort of interact with the built environment here shortly. But I wanted to leave you with kind of three things I used to think about in my previous job that Scott's well aware of, on how we thought about sustainability-oriented innovation in the company. And so how do we think differently about changing the mindset of those that are involved in the innovation agenda to think differently about sustainability as it affects the design or the research that we might be doing in this space? So the first phase that we typically expect companies to be comfortable with in sustainable innovation is something that we call sustainability relevant. This is a paper, by the way, if you're interested, the links, and we'll share these slides with you as part of the next step. But this is a body of work that was done at MIT Sloan, which I think was certainly gives it some degree of credibility. But sustainability relevant is really the traditional practice of design. It's where we look at perhaps efficiency or performance or capacity or even cost with an outcome that might produce something that we can point to and say it's sustainable, but it certainly wasn't led with sustainability in mind. But it produces a relevant kind of outcome in terms of the design or innovation that we're working on. When we get real serious about this in the companies, we become sustainability informed. This is where we've defined a design system that allows trade-offs to be taken around attributes that are measured in the context of sustainability. So is it designed for reuse? Is it designed for recovery? Is it designed for circularity? Is it designed for water efficiency? Is it designed for nature efficiency? So it's thinking differently about the design attributes as they affect how the innovation is associated with the decision making that goes on there. Design for sustainability is a thing. There are practices and guidance out there in terms of how you might incorporate that into a company like yours and start thinking differently about, like I said, decision making that goes into product design and innovation around these topics. The last area is probably one of the more challenging to think about as a company. Companies don't often think about how they reinvent themselves. Some do. But some, when they get there, are actually really practicing sustainability as a driven outcome. So sustainability-driven innovation really thinks differently about the design of your business associated with the products and services you provide. You know, one obvious example for your industry, and I know this has been talked about for at least as many years as I've been involved in this industry, is you're not selling an air conditioner, you're selling cooling. So cooling as a service, right, could be a completely different business model that somebody like your organization thinks about. It changes the way you think about your business, the business you're practicing, and certainly adds a lot of complexity to how you might execute that business model. But that's a sustainability-driven innovation solution, for example. Now, thinking about this in the context of the built environment, that you're probably most likely to be interacting with. You know it's a very complex environment. You know that decision-making takes many different forms in the building system, whether you're at the core of its design, its construction, its ownership, its occupancy, and how it's utilized, or whether you're in the influential areas in terms of the AEC firms, the architecture, engineering, consulting firms, the property developers and their influential role, or whether you're at that real sort of outer area of finance and how investors and financial institutions start thinking about these issues. Well, this chart is intended to represent two things. One, gives you sort of the sense of the complexity of the built environment system you interact with, but it's also to suggest there are starting to be alignment conversations around how these issues are being discussed amongst the various actors involved in this supply chain, whether it's the structural engineers making a commitment to reduce their embodied carbon projects by 2050, whether it's GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance, where 450 financial firms have committed to accelerating decarbonization of the economy. These are all going to start to have major influence on how the built environment decision-making will be undertaken when it comes to getting to net zero, if you will. Just to highlight a couple of things in the COP world, in that Conference of Parties world, particularly the climate COP. Some of you may have been familiar with some of the conversations that have taken place recently in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Next year, the COP will be in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai. And we're seeing a marked increase in how countries, this is the country level measure, are thinking about incorporating built environment into their nationally determined contributions. The climate commitments that they will take as companies are increasingly inclusive of built environment decision-making, country by country. And in 2023 at COP28, we are certainly expecting there to be much more emphasis on air conditioning, given it's in one of the hottest parts of the world. And we're already hearing some early indications of mobilization of companies around these topics will be taking place. And then, to sort of bring it back to WBCSD, what are we thinking about in the context of the built environment? We bring our members together that are operating in this space around these core goals to get to a 40% energy-related reduction. The realization that 40% of total energy-related emissions are associated with the built environment. It's 40% of global resource use, and it's 40% of waste production. So it's a large beast, if you will, in the environmental, social world that we're trying to address. So we create an environment for full collaboration, and I'll show you the members that are involved with us as an organization to get to this common understanding and measurement for the built environment of what it means to become net zero carbon, what it means to become circular, nature positive, and more equitable around the objectives we take in how we think about the role we play in the built environment system. And then we leave it to companies to take the decisions as to how best they will take these practices going forward to get to that space that we need to. The members of WBCSD's Built Environment Project today, just listed here, it's a subset of those that I showed you earlier, but obviously these are some very important companies to be interacting with in some of these topics. It does represent a full cross-section of the supply chain. There is a separate body of work that we have at WBCSD on financing the built environment. So we are working with a number of financial institutions that have recognized that they need to better understand decision-making on the financial terms for how to put forward mechanisms, finance mechanisms for getting to net zero and addressing some of these issues. And then, I leave this with you. There's a lot going on this slide. We're certainly very productive in terms of providing information and knowledge and raising awareness. The most interesting body of work you might find useful is the Building System Carbon Framework that we released in 2020, which is a framework around how to measure not only operational carbon, which I think certainly your product lines can be associated with, but also to account for embodied carbon, and which is increasingly important in the total footprinting of the building systems going forward. So this chart, you certainly can build back and go look at some of these resources as to how to inform or perhaps think differently about your role in innovating in the built environment. And then early next year, we will produce a new sort of benchmark around how low can we go? What are the practices that are taking shape today that are getting at these large principal commitments around having emissions by 2030 and how close we'll get to getting there. So a lot of information will be available in January, and you can certainly keep your eyes open for this report going forward. And I'll end with this slide, because there's again, this is certainly something to think about in the world of innovation. So, today information is sparse. First to admit that whole life carbon data collection is certainly something that we need more companies to take ownership of. We understand the practices and procedures of some companies today, but in order to get to a better accounting of the net zero agenda we're trying to drive towards, we need to increase our efforts on whole life carbon data collection. Certainly the outcomes, the outputs of the built environment are going to be very important to understand. So how low can we go? Where are we today? What are best practices today that are allowing us to see just how big of a challenge we have? Some of our early reports that were referenced on the previous chart have provided some case benchmarking cases that were performed by Arup, one of the major engineering firms, who did a whole body of work for us in that space. So you might find some of their results and conclusions interesting. We're starting to develop a much more of an interactive approach with the architecture, engineering, and consultancy firms out there to certainly be better informed on how to inform client decisions, how to inform perhaps mindset changes so that we can create more demand for these types of projects going forward. And then underlying in terms of technologies, certainly digitalization, information flow, not just through the design process, but frankly through the life of the building, is going to be increasingly required to better understand performance and outcomes of these built environment results. Certainly a much better appreciation for informing decision making. So EPD is environmental product declarations, and how to inform supply chain decision making on choices they may take in terms of the products and end uses that they will build into their decision making for solutions for buildings. And then lastly, but certainly not least important, probably most important, is how to inform and change how we think about financing and the built environment going forward. Talked a little bit about that on a previous chart, but certainly a lot more work that we're planning to support going forward and working with the financial institutions on that particular problem space. So Scott, I'm done. I certainly have offered you hopefully a lot of things, a lot of topics to think about. Certainly open for questions. I know I kind of left things a bit high level, but that's where the fun begins. So I'll turn it back to you if you want to offer up some moderation.
Absolutely. Bill, that was terrific. First of all, I'd like to thank you, and maybe we could all thank our speaker today. And I invite anybody to ask a question. Just please unmute yourself and ask away. Maybe I will start and ask you a big and perhaps hard question, and that is, businesses and markets are designed and operated primarily to grow, and to grow exponentially, right? I mean, this is a very deeply ingrained paradigm. Does that need to change or evolve in some way, or can we have our cake and eat it too? Right. And so
that's such a good and important question. So let me try to unpack it a little bit. How's growth measured? How do companies actually sort of inform capital markets that they're on a growth trajectory? Well, it's called discounted cash flows, and certainly all the choices we make and all the things we think about as companies that are going to lead to growth curves, forecast growth curves that companies can sell to the financial markets. It's our fundamental belief that financial markets care about that and will continue to care about that, but they're also going to increasingly be looking at these non-financial factors in their growth assessments. So you can't fool the financial markets in saying I'm going to grow exponentially by continuing to rely on fossil fuels. It's a non-starter. And so you've got to have growth factors in your valuation assessment that account for the decision making you're making on those types of things. Naturally, if you're a wood company, you can't keep harvesting forests, right? There's not going to be any forests left. So wood companies have to think forest product companies have to think very differently now about how they're informing capital markets on their sustainability as a business and the choices they're taking as a business. So very much a changing landscape. Next year, we're in fact launching a whole valuation program at WBCSD to kind of take a big step back and say, what does valuation of the future, and I'm not talking 20 years from now, I'm talking 3 years from now, need to look like if we're really going to get our arms around these issues? So a really important question, Scott, and it's, when you and I used to talk about sustainability a few years ago, probably more like 15 years ago, it was a very different world because the financial markets weren't involved. The fact that they've arrived on the scene and a third of assets under management and increasing are tied to these types of investments, game over. The train's left the station and valuation models are going to need to change.
It's interesting. So we have questions from some of our people here. So Matt, why don't you start?
Actually, Chris has been waiting.
Yeah, I think Chris had his hand up first. So,
okay, Chris, you
nice
can
job
go
moderating,
first.
Scott. Chris, you're
We are
first.
polite here.
All right. Thank you. Great talk, Bill. I really appreciate your thoughts, and it's interesting to learn about all the work that you're doing in this area. I work a lot in the built environment, HVAC systems and so forth. And one of the things that sort of really perplexes me about how to change is that, if we go back to even the 70s, when the US started putting like building codes and a lot of this stuff started to emerge, the decision was made to make it very prescriptive as opposed to performance-based, because it's so hard to enforce the performance-based. There's so much, I guess, from a commercial perspective, there's so much risk they're taking on by making something performance-based. And the building industry is a really, really tough one, because I could see companies saying, well, how much of my carbon budget is actually informed by, Joe building a house over here, how good of a job he does. And so how does this work on a very practical basis to take these objectives, which a company like Mitsubishi Electric could accomplish on the perspective of their own equipment in terms of efficiencies, but really to transform the built environment like you're talking about without really exposing themselves to too much risk in a certain sense?
It's a great question. And I wish I had a perfect answer, but I don't. I can say that markets that are requiring companies to disclose their climate performance, their climate-related financial disclosures is what it's technically referred to, are increasingly going to be under pressure to account for these issues, right? And so the built environment is not going to be on the sidelines. We know it's a major factor in sort of the climate agenda today. Yep. So where I think this is going to go is going to be a mix of regulation from, the DOEs of the world to move to allow, codes to move to the performance-based platform. I haven't kept up with that, to be honest with you, in my world. So I'm not quite sure where those are at the moment. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, the regulators, like the financial market regulators, like the SEC, requiring companies to account for these issues in their building stock in particular, is going to put pressure on them to think differently about the choices they make. So you're sitting in the middle for sure. Perhaps your company in and of itself will have to start worrying about the financial market disclosure requirements, but where you sit in terms of where your customers and the decision making that's going to take place might start to put pressure on them to think differently about the carbon choices they're making. I don't have a crystal ball, Chris. I wish I did and could tell you how it's actually all going to work, but I think these mechanisms are going to drive the change. And you know, I think certainly believe that there will be sort of an accounting challenge when the CFOs of some of these companies start to realize that they're holding a legacy footprint that is no longer tolerant of the carbon accounting position that they're trying to get to. So I think there'll be pressure. We're still kind of in that transition where we don't have the regulations yet. We certainly don't have the perfect energy codes and climate codes in the system yet. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, these things will start to self-correct. Anyway, that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts.
Okay, now Matt.
Okay, so I have a slightly frivolous question and a serious question. The lighter question is, are ESG are ESG funds outperforming vice funds yet?
So it depends on where you want to take the snapshot. I know in the 2 years we were looking at this from 2020 and 2021, they were outperforming the market. I think this year's been a bit of a drag on everyone in the financial markets. So I'm not sure I have the data for this year. But I do know that in the 2 years we were looking at it in 20 and 21, clear, points performance benefit for funds. And we did our own study. There's plenty of studies out there you can reference with that information.
I wasn't asking about the general market. I was compared to vice funds, which
vice funds. You mean
vice?
You mean like cigarettes and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, they bet on major polluters, arms manufacturers.
I don't have the data, but just against the general market, I would suspect. I don't have the data, Matt. Do you? Just curious.
No, I'm not. It's not a trick question. I'm just.
No, I don't have the data. I suspect that against the general market, it would still be an uptick. I can actually have somebody run that analysis though. I'm interested now that you've asked that question. So let me do that. I'm happy to pass the answer back to you.
I'd be curious to hear too, and not just for selfish reasons. And then more seriously, the federal government is considering reducing its discounting rate, which it uses for evaluating the economic pros and cons of major policy decisions. Apparently, the Trump administration bumped it up to about 7%, which basically means that they don't care about anything that happens 20 years from now, because they'll be gone.
Let's not get political now.
Yeah, and it's apparently down around 3 or 4 now, and they're considering a reduction to 2, which actually means fairly long-term views of the consequences of building a dam or changing a benefits program or something like that. So,
right.
Do you have any idea what the appetite in the companies that you work with or represent, what they would like? I understand some companies actually will just by default use the government rate in looking at their own large capital spending plans.
So the knowledge of certainly some of our members, I mean, AB InBev is a great example, the beverage company, right? Maybe a vice company, and you might think of it that way, have done some really creative financial financing using kind of the green, I guess what I would call the green benefit. So they're linking the capital rate to their ESG performance, and we're seeing, and financial institutions are accepting that as a basis for lowering their discount rate. So I think we're seeing trends in that regard. I don't know about the basis of how a lot of, just sort of generally how companies are thinking about this. I can say some of the more progressive ones are tying their rates to ESG performance as a basis of interacting with financial markets. So that's clear. I think on just an interesting data point, if you're paying attention to these things, which sounds like you are, I was just yesterday or the day before on a call with a gentleman who's introducing language to be considered in the federal, I think it's the Federal Acquisition Regulations. The FAR language will begin to incorporate ESG requirements on companies if they're going to do business with the federal government. And so that's, if you do quite a bit of business with the federal government and you're not paying attention to these issues, you may want to start thinking about that. But the logic being, there's a lot of companies out there that are practicing well in these regards and won't have an issue with that kind of a requirement. So anyway, I just you got me thinking about that on the basis of your question. So sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
And while I've got you, I noticed a lot of the companies in your partners slide or group slide are essentially largely in the controls and design space. So they have a business interest in helping the world retool for more efficient buildings or new structures or systems or new subways, whatever. What do you think it would take to get something like Koch Industries into your membership?
KOCH, that Koch?
KOCH, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never spoken with anyone at Koch, so I don't have a sense of where they are in their journey, as we like to say in the sustainability world. I'd be remiss in saying I spend a lot of time looking at the Koch website to know whether they have
not them in particular, but obviously,
yeah. But I think
industries are going to suffer a lot more pain on the road to sustainability.
Yeah, I think there's a day of reckoning ahead, and some of the companies that are going to have to start to think real differently about how they exist in this kind of changing world are going to have to deal with it. To your point, though, I'm looking at the project members now. You don't see it because I'm not sharing my screen, but a couple of interesting companies that have joined us just within the last couple of years. So Autodesk, right?
Design.
It took a bit of effort, but man, they are quite active now in understanding how their platform supports this conversation, right? Last year's Swire Pacific, so big property developer in Asia, is now a member and active in this space. Skanska, a construction company, right? They historically have been involved with us in this area, but clearly active. Holcim, cement, probably one of the biggest challenges we face in how to move to sustainable cement, and they're very active in thinking about that with us. And then, of course, your competitors, Trane, Johnson Controls, others are certainly having conversations with us. Google, another really interesting one, right? A company that you might not think of having an interest in this space, but yeah, they're looking at the business model question and whether there's practice for them in this regard. So anyway.
Right. Yeah, of those, only the cement manufacturers. This is a surprise.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but the original membership was UTC and there was one large cement company.
Lafarge. It was Lafarge. It was Lafarge Holcim, which it was actually Lafarge, and then Holcim bought Lafarge, and it became Lafarge Holcim, and now it's Holcim. So go figure.
And, you can't. It's hard. You're hard pressed to find a company that produces more CO2.
Yeah, exactly. And their business is at threat, right? Unless they start to think differently. And of course, they have a whole different set of problems, which is they can make more sustainable cement. It's just who's going to buy it, who's going to pay the price to utilize it, right? And so they've got to think differently about how the supply chain works, the value chain works, and how they can be influential in decision making, just as much as sort of the Swire Pacifics of the world.
Yeah, I was just looking at the membership. So, of the Mitsubishi companies, which Mitsubishi Electric is a separate corporation, of course, but, MHI is a member and Mitsubishi Chemical Holdings is also a member. and the Mitsubishi Corporation. So it's interesting.
Yeah, we do have I mean, I mentioned this earlier that there's a concentration of interest, certainly amongst Japanese companies, that it starts with the Toyotas of the world, but manifests itself now into different areas of the Japanese economy, and increasingly, one of their major topics of interest that we're going to be supporting as we go into 2023 is on something called Scope 4, or avoided emissions. So how am I accounting for the emissions I don't produce, right? And it's a really interesting topic, and admittedly, I'm no expert on it, but I think that may be something for you to consider in how you think about where you position in the decision making associated with an organization like ours. So